Good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings, on behalf of all those present, I would like to acknowledge that this webinar is hosted on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. This session will now be recorded. We'll record audio, screen share and our presenters. We will not be recording any video or audio input from the audience. Welcome to all UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Corey. I'm a project and research officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, UTS ACRI. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese studies centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship between these countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you want to learn more about UTS ACRI and the Australia-China relationship, details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org, no spaces. Today, we're happy to host this webinar, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, What Can Australia Do as US PRC Rivalry Intensifies? This discusses Canberra's options in terms of managing its relationship with China and the United States and advancing Australia's national interests as great power competition continues to heat up and impact our region. The main presentation in this webinar is from Professor Zhiqun Zhu, a professor of political science and international relations at Bucknell University and currently a US Fulbright Scholar at Griffith University. Presentation will be followed by a discussion featuring Professor Zhu and Dr. Lai-Hai, Senior Lecturer in the Social and Political Sciences Program, School of Communications at the UTS. This will be moderated by a person that needs no introduction, UTS ACRI's Director and esteemed economist, James Lawrenson. To the audience, if you'd like to submit questions, please do so via the Q&A button on the bottom bar. I will now hand you over to Professor Lawrenson.
Thanks very much, Corey. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. Look, it's our real pleasure to host this webinar today. I think there is tremendous value in having visitors based overseas, in Professor Zhu's case in the US, spend some time in Australia, become acquainted with Australia's discussion around China and the US-China strategic competition, and then share those views with a broader Australian audience. So that really is our task here. And good on the Fulbright Commission and the US Embassy for supporting Professor Zhu's visit. I hope in the coming months we might be able to do a similar event with some colleagues based in China. It's great to have my UTS colleague Lai-Hai joining us as well today. Look, we're going to start off with about a 10-minute presentation from Professor Zhu, and then we're going to a moderated Q&A, and after that, be some questions from the audience. So, Professor Zhu, I might go straight to you. Let's hear. You've spent the last few months in Brisbane, but you've travelled to Sydney, I know that, and I think you've been to Canberra as well. Keen to hear your thoughts on how Australia can manage this seemingly incredibly difficult task. As US-China rivalry heats up, how can Canberra best position itself? Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Lawrenson. And hello from Brisbane. I want to thank you, Professor Lawrenson, and the Australia-China Relations Institute for organizing this event. I look forward to a stimulating dialogue with Dr. Lai-Hai, Professor Lawrenson, and the audience. We all know US-China competition is a defining theme of our time. Much scholarly and policy research has focused on the two great powers and how their policies are affecting international security and global economy. What is understudied is the role of third parties stuck between the two great powers. And Australia is one of such third parties. So today we're going to talk about what Australia can do as US-China rivalry intensifies. Since I only have 10 minutes for my opening remarks, well, 9.5 now, I will briefly cover 3 points. Number one, the third party's dilemma from an IPE perspective. Number two, where does Australia stand now in the US-China rivalry? And finally, Australia's options. So very quickly, point number one, the Ipe Theoretical Perspective. We all know that the dynamic between economics and security is at the core of international political economy, or IPE. The economics and security nexus is a key concept in IPE. Most research on the economics security nexus focuses on how a state deals with economic and security challenges from one or multiple sources in its external relations. Now, facing conflicting economic and security interests, many countries have adopted a strategy called hedging. Basically, it means you do not put all your eggs in one basket. Now, in practice, these countries wish to maximize trade and investment ties with China and welcome China to join their development, but they also feel the need to maintain close security relationships with the United States. This is what I call a dual track structure in IPE, and this structure will not change anytime soon. Countries like Australia that have huge stakes in maintaining good relations with both the United States and China will continue to face this dilemma in their foreign policies. So that's number one. Number two, my second point, where does Australia stand now? And how have other US allies and partners managed relations with the United States and China? Australia is not alone being stuck between a rock and a hard place. US allies and partners all face this dilemma, but they are dealing with the challenge very differently. Now, for example, the South Koreans have developed this concept called Amenable or Amenable, which means relying on the United States for its security interests and on China for its economic interests. So Amenable is evident in South Korea's cultivation of deep economic and diplomatic ties with China and the maintenance of security guarantees through the US ROK alliance, regardless of the president's party affiliation. Now, recently, for example, in a way not to offend China, President Yoon Suk-yeol, who is perceived to be more pro-US than his predecessor Moon Jae-in, actually avoided meeting with Nancy Pelosi as she traveled from Taipei to Seoul during that controversial trip. And President Yoon and President Xi Jinping exchanged congratulatory notes to celebrate the 30 years of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Now, Singapore is a partner of the United States. It's a small country that has played an outsized but positive role in international affairs. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has repeatedly said, don't force us to choose sides in the big power rivalry. The message from Singapore has been clear. We want to maintain strong relations with both of you. Furthermore, you guys need to resolve your differences peacefully and diplomatically. And Singapore has been consistent and clear in stating its position. Now, final example I want to give is Israel. There's no doubt that US support is vital for Israel's security, but Israel also wants to maintain a productive and friendly relations with China. You may know that Jews have a special relationship with the Chinese. Right? In more contemporary history, when the Jews were escaping from wars, pogroms, and Holocaust during World War I and World War II, they found safe haven in China, in Harbin and Shanghai, respectively. So, of course, this is not the only reason why Israel wants to maintain friendly relations with China. Other, perhaps more important reasons include seeking China's neutrality in the Israel-Arab conflict and welcoming China to invest in Israel. A story that is often told about Israel's dilemma is this new port in the city of Haifa. A Chinese company, the Shanghai International Port Group, won a bid to build the new port in 2015. The new Haifa port has caused grave concerns in the United States, since it is adjacent to where the US Sixth Fleet warships routinely dock. So both the Trump and Biden administrations exerted tremendous pressure on Israel to restrict cooperation with China. Israel, anyway, went ahead with the construction of the new port by the Chinese company, which actually went operational in September 2021, a year ago. And now the Chinese company is managing the new port for 25 years. And China and Israel are also finalizing a free trade agreement, which is China's first with a country in the Middle East. So most countries in the Indo-Pacific prefer to maintain good relations with both the United States and China. A few countries, particularly Japan, Great Britain, and Australia, are following the United States very closely in countering China at the expense of their relations with China. Now, Australia is a member of all major US-led small groups aimed at countering China, including the AUKUS, the Quad, the Five Eyes. Australia has also joined the United States in military exercises in the South China Sea. Now, the question is, or are several questions, is Australia happy with the current situation between the United States and China, and between Australia and China? Is Australia helping to raise or lower tensions in the Asia Pacific? And what best serves Australia's national interests? We all know that Australia has made some independent and wise decisions before. For example, then opposition leader Gough Whitlam traveled to China in 1971, around the same time as Henry Kissinger secretly visited Beijing. Whitlam normalized relations with China in December 1972, shortly after taking office, actually 6 years ahead of the United States. In 2015, Australia, together with many other US allies, joined the Chinese-initiated Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, despite opposition from the United States. So clearly, Australia knows how to take care of itself and defend its own national interests. Now, this comes to my final and third point. What can Australia do? Being a key ally of the United States, I think Australia will side with the United States by default. But as some of my Australian colleagues told me, though Australia and the United States are allies and share many values, their interests do not completely converge. And when Australia's interests are not served, Australia should say no and should not follow Washington uncritically. Now, if we apply the economic security nexus in IPE here, clearly it's in Australia's interests to maintain good relations with both the United States and China. I think probably most Australians would agree on this, although they may disagree on what Australia should do. So as an outsider, please allow me to offer some food for thought. Australia can continue to stand firmly with the United States and follow the US leadership in confronting China. Or it perhaps can try to maintain some autonomy within the alliance and develop a more independent foreign policy, like it did in the past. And furthermore, it can perhaps help reduce tensions between the United States and China and promote peace in the region. US-China relations have been poisoned by domestic politics on both sides, and their competition is really zero-sum, even negative-sum. This is not in their own interests and not in the interests of the international community. Unfortunately, it seems to me, Washington and Beijing are unable to manage their rivalry constructively. And military conflict is a real possibility, as demonstrated in the Taiwan Strait crisis recently. So it is urgent for other countries to help them to stop the continued deterioration of the relationship before they head towards collision. Australia, I think, is in a unique position to play a leadership role in this effort. It's a major ally of the United States, and relations with China have shown improvement with the new government in Canberra. To deflect pressures for taking sides in the great power competition, Australia perhaps can form a middle power coalition with like-minded countries facing similar dilemmas. Such a coalition serves every country's interest and sends a clear message to the United States and China that they should lower tensions and not impose their wills upon others. More specifically, Australia can encourage both the United States and China to cool down in the Taiwan Strait and help them to reach a modus vivendi to restore the delicate status quo. In the South Pacific, Australia, as the leader of the region, can perhaps form a regional organization, something like the South Pacific Cooperation Organization, something similar to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to bring all parties together, including the United States and China. And if this sounds too ambitious, then perhaps we can make use of the existing Pacific Islands Forum and the new partners in the Blue Pacific Initiative. I think pushing Chinese influence out of the Pacific is going to be futile because China already has a sizable presence here, and the regional countries generally welcome Chinese investment in the region. The priorities of Pacific countries are, number one, combating climate change. Number two, promoting development. And China can contribute positively to both. Why don't we get China involved here? So I really believe, Australia can serve as a bridge between the United States and China and help bring them together in Asia Pacific and build trust through cooperation in the region. This will serve everybody's interest. Now, before I conclude, I think what I have proposed is perhaps too optimistic and largely based on realism or idealism, right? I think we need to inject a dose of realism, in our discussion. Let's be frank. To take any positive actions and move forward, the Australian government faces double pressures now, externally from the United States and internally from an anti-China political environment. So unfortunately, it's easier said than done in terms of how Australia can help lower tensions between the United States and China. So what we need now is, political courage and wisdom. And I will stop here. Sorry if I have used more than 10 minutes.
No, that's fine, Professor Zhu. And it always is the case that things are easier said than done, right? Look, just a couple immediate thoughts came to my mind. To hear you say that, in your view, it appears that right now the US and China are unable to manage their rivalry constructively. That's very confronting for an Australian audience to hear, but it was interesting that when you're talking about Australia's agency, that is responding to that situation, you were actually talking up Australia's agency. So for example, you talked about, the possibility of Australia playing a mediating role, drawing the US, China and Australia into collaborative projects in the South Pacific, building a middle power coalition to deflect pressure from both great powers and so on. But then you did finish by saying, well, look, maybe that's too idealistic. So look, I'd like to, we're all academics, so we're used to the process of peer review. So in that spirit, Dr. Chen, I'd like to bring in you immediately and just ask for your assessment of the viability of the strategy that Professor Zhu is laying out. So just to be clear, any strategy, of course, does not guarantee success. But what I'm asking is does that seem like a reasonable path forward? At least when benchmarks against alternative paths that Australia might take, such as fully aligning itself with the US in any and every decision. Over to you, Dr. Chen.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me here, and lovely to hear Professor Zhu's presentations. It's very excellent. So I think you already mentioned about that. This is a rather ideal situation. So of course, we need to think about what is the reality first. So I think the subjection itself is basically very interesting and very, I also hope that one day this kind of the idealism will succeed eventually. However, if we can get back to the reality, in my personal opinion, this is kind of a mission impossible. It's very difficult, if not impossible, for Australia to act as a mediator in the great power competition between the US and China. Just say, I take an example or metaphor. For example, if we are in the middle of the day, just after lunch or even maybe before lunch, if I say Australia wants to, holding a banquet to invite the two disputing parties to sit down together and try to resolve their, the conflict. And so Australians prepare a huge banquet and decide the whole menu. The question is like, we need to think about whether that menu is suitable for both sides, the disputing parties. Do they accept that? Will they come and sit down, and will be allergic to the food? And Australia, you need to understand what kind of food you need to offer. So that is just a metaphor. So, but from a, if we can get back to the academic point of view, so conflict management and a third-party mediation in international relations, if I can use this kind of the academic point, involving basically 4 key features. So about the conflict management. So the first key feature is about the nature of the disputing parties. So the question is, will China happy to listen? So I would say at this stage, no. Because the mindset in Beijing basically is that China is the great power, and all other countries basically, regardless whether you are middle power, small power, from the Chinese perspective, they are all small powers. And so this kind of the hierarchy mindset from the Beijing, the regime is very deep. And so it would be difficult to change that. Second feature about this like the conflict management or the third party mediation is about the nature of the dispute itself. So the dispute itself, you see the great power rivalry currently, we can name, as you also mentioned about that, the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, and including the high-tech competition as well. So if we're looking at the first two, the South China Sea issue and the Taiwan issue, from Chinese perspective, I don't think this is like negotiable. There's no compromise, because from Chinese side, this is a sovereignty. This is a domestic issue. This is part of the, the country's sovereign rights as well. So there's no compromise from the Chinese perspective. And if you're looking at the high tech, like the 5G network, or even right now, the semiconductor, from the US perspective, that's also basically non-negotiable. So the nature of the dispute itself is another point. Then the third, so we're looking at the two from the great powers perspective, like we get back to the Australians about that side. So Australia, there's another 2 more key features about this, like the third party mediation. It's about the identity and characteristic of the mediator and the strategies and tactics with the mediator users. And so the mediator basically need to be seen as kind of a neutral position. So I'm not saying that this is an absolute term, because all the country, every even individual country, they also have their the tilt to one side rather than being neutral, but not in an absolute term, but rather being seen more or less as a neutral position. So in this regard, I would say if you're looking at the Asian country in the region, probably ASEAN or even Singapore could act as the mediator role, but not Australia. Because Australia, as we say, you're already tilting to the US. And how can the China will trust, because China assume you are the US ally, and all of this, like the current last few years, particularly the foreign policy, is already telling China that you are already picking the side. There's no neutral position. So China will not accept that. And in terms of the identity and characteristics, so that is the thing. And final point about this, like the strategy and tactic is like, if you China basically will not accept the authority of the international, the tribunal, like for example, even though you're putting, two great power on the table and try to negotiate, but will China listen? So China even do not accept the international law under the international tribunal. How would China accept the Australians putting the plan, putting the banquet on the table? So that is my 2 cents.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Chen. So we have some principles here that we can all coalesce around, but when translating those into reality, in your view, is going to be quite a challenge, if not mission impossible. Professor Zhu, I'd like to come back to you. If I could just stick with these principles for a moment, because I think, whether they're realistic or not, they're worth interrogating for a couple other reasons. In Australia, I think we're very familiar. You mentioned a middle power coalition to deflect pressure from both great powers. Now, I get the concept. In Australia, of course, we're very familiar with pressure from Beijing. During your time here, you would have heard many Australians tell you about, after we called out China's island building in the South China Sea, after we blocked Huawei from participating in Australia's 5G rollout, after we introduced foreign interference legislation, there were consequences. They included the cutting off of senior political dialogue, economic sanctions, and we should also be clear, even extending so far as what looks to me to be hostage diplomacy. And I think that, we should raise the plight of those Australian citizens detained in China at every opportunity, Cheng-Lei and Yongheng Jun. So there's pretty serious consequences there. Professor Zhu, but you were talking about deflecting pressure from both sides. So I just wanted to ask you, in your mind, does the Australian public have to sensitize themselves to the possibility of retaliation or repercussions from the US if we don't go along with what Washington wants? Because I don't, in Australia, we talk about the ANZUS alliance being 100 years of mateship and unbreakable alliance and so on. But is it possible that Washington could hit us with pressure, coercive pressure as well?
Yes. So in terms of whether Australia faces political, economic, and diplomatic pressures from the United States, should Australia have more autonomy in its alliance with the United States? What about AUKUS and nuclear submarines? Have there been enough public debates on such critical issues before decisions are made? I think those questions have to be answered by the Australians. Now, you mentioned the pressure from China. I think if you look at the history of Australia-China relations in the past 50 years, there have been ups and downs. And no doubt, the past few years are definitely one of the lowest points. You mentioned the Chinese pressure campaigns and economic sanctions against Australia, which I believe are really disturbing, from Australia's perspective. But to be fair, I think Australia has also contributed to the deterioration of the bilateral relationship. I think some Australian politicians and Australian media have somehow determined that China is the enemy, and they operate based on this overblown threat from China. Now back to the hostage issue you mentioned. You mentioned Cheng-Lei, right? I think the other day, if I remember correctly, the Chinese ambassador Xiao Chen said he would be willing to help on the humanitarian basis. I think that's a positive sign. The defense ministers and the foreign ministers from the two countries have met, and there are also some talks about a possible meeting between Xi Jinping and Anthony Albanese in Bali, Indonesia next month. So I like to maintain some optimistic attitude here. I think both sides seem ready to reset the relationship. We got to be optimistic in this crazy world, right? And so yes, the pressures from China and also potential from the United States are real, but what can we do about it? I think we still need to move forward in terms of managing the relationship. You talk about two sets of relationships here, right? Australia, China, and Australia, United States. And by the way, I'm talking about the bridge between United States and China. I'm not necessarily talking about serving as a mediator. I think mediator is such a strong word. I don't think anybody is interested in mediating between the China and United States. I think Dr. Chan is right. I don't think the United States and China would even listen to anybody trying to mediate between. What I'm suggesting is basically to present a consistent and concerted voice to these two powers, countries like Australia and other US allies and partners especially. Just tell them that, look, this is not the situation we like, and this is detrimental to international community. It hurts everybody's interests. So you guys need to really sit down and lower the tensions, talk to each other diplomatically. So that's my original thinking. I'm not really suggesting that somebody should be a judge or a mediator between the two powers. Anyway, that's a clarification. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I was interested to read the former Australian ambassador to Washington, Joe Hockey's memoirs recently, where he claims that President Obama asked him to, or asked the Australian government to stop Australian iron ore sales to China. I find that quite hard to believe, but that's his claim. We certainly know that President Obama put pressure on the Australian government to not join the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, weren't happy about the Port of Darwin. So it is interesting for an Australian audience, because we're hit with Chinese sanctions, and they're real. I'm not disputing them at all, but it is, it's worthwhile sort of broadening the horizon to thinking about the pressures that could come from both sides. Dr. Chan, can I go to you on a similar question? I think it's always useful to not just look at the world from Sydney or Canberra or Melbourne, but to think about how our region is viewing this rivalry. When Indonesia or when Singapore or when Korea looks at the Philippines, when they look at the United States and China, do you think they're equally worried about pressure coming from both of the great powers? Are the United States and China qualitatively different in this respect? Because I think in Australia we have this view that they are, right? China puts in place coercive measures, the United States doesn't. Now, I was wondering if you had any comments on how the region views that issue.
Yes, sorry, because I lose my cursor. I couldn't really figure it out. Yeah, thanks, James. I think this is a very tough question. I have to think about answering your question. I think it would be better to separate into two different parts. The first part, I would say yes. In terms of if you're looking at the all this economic sanction, we can see China to work. Australia to Philippines before, and other countries, etc. So the US did use the same strategy to advance its interests as well. And I wouldn't say the US never used that. Yes, the both great powers, they use the same strategy, use the same methods as a political pressure to try to advance their interests. However, if you're looking at the mechanism, so basically it's quite different. So why the Asian country will worry, or not just Asian country, even back to Sweden as well. They are also worried about whether you will have this kind of the economic sanction. So from the US, they did have the economic sanction, but those economic sanctions are more in an open, the perspective, or open, more specific. And they even have their domestic law to do the administration about this, implement this economic sanction. I take an example. Like the US, if you say more recently, you can see the economic sanction on Russia in the war of Ukraine, and also Iran before, and US also used the economic sanction against Iran. So, but Iran, you can see they have the Iran, what's it called, the act, like the Libya and Sanction Act, back in the 1990s and the early of these centuries as well. And so they also have the administrator to administer this kind of the Sanction Act against Iran. So that is the mechanism is more open and specific. But if you're looking at China, we never know this is a formal economic sanction. So, but of course, you use Australia as an example. We know this is the economic sanction, but did the Chinese government admit that? No, they didn't. They didn't think that is a sanction or against another country. And so this is rather informal. And you never know which agent, in China or agency in China, they administer this kind of the sanction. So this is the way it's completely like the different thing.
Thanks, Dr. Chen. Yeah, that is an important distinction. You're right. The way the two countries implement these measures, and I've certainly heard that myself as well, that the US does so transparently and on the basis of domestic law. Mind you, I'm not so sure if Beijing had a domestic sanctions law and implemented it transparently. I don't think that we'd suddenly think that that's okay from an Australian perspective. I think we'd still have some pretty grave concerns. Professor Zhu, back to you. I'd like to hit you with a question now that I think many Australians will want to hear your view on. It's this: why shouldn't Australia be all in with its security ally, the United States? I mean, there are plenty of Australians who say, gee, you know what, a region dominated by China, where China has primacy, would be pretty horrible for Australia's interests and confronting for our values. We don't want that. So really what we should be doing is not, looking to straddle between the two. We need to be all in on the United States. In fact, we need to be doing what we can to keep the United States engaged in the region, or even more engaged in the region. A potential permanent US base perhaps, or hosting US military assets. That's what we should be doing. This is no time for mucking around, right? So that's what some Australians would say. What would be your response to that?
Thanks for that question. I can attest that Australia is really a dynamic democracy, and people here have very diverse views. And if you look at the public opinion polls, I think the majority would support strong US-Australia alliance. And increasingly, people view China together with Russia and perhaps North Korea as major security threat. I don't challenge that the general sentiment. I think we all share that sentiment. What I'm suggesting here is the proper approach if we agree that China is a challenge. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, are we happy with the situation in terms of US-China relations and Australia-China relations? Can we do something about it, right? Secondly, what we decide to do help ameliorate the situation? Do we want to add fuel to the fire or to help to lower tensions? Is the current approach to China more likely or less likely to lead to conflict and war in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the Taiwan Strait? Will confrontation with China make China more liberal? So those are the questions I want to challenge or ask everybody. I think every country needs to have such public debates and reach some consensus about the best approach they can take.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've said something really important there, and that is, because I often hear this in Australia, we can all accept that China has changed, as our Prime Minister likes to say. We can also all accept that China's behaviour challenges Australia's interests. But taking that as a given, then we do need to question how do we respond to it? And you can respond to it in constructive ways or productive ways, or ways, as you said, that can actually make it worse. So look, let me use that point to pivot to you, Dr. Chan. Look, this is stepping a little bit away from what Professor Zhu has talked about today. But Dr. Chan, you would know, Australia, obviously, we're very connected institutionally with the United States via the ANZUS alliance, most obviously, but AUKUS, the Quad, and so on. Do you think it is possible for Australia to be genuinely committed to those US-centered minilaterals at the same time as we take a more, a more balanced and constructive role towards China? Or do you think China will just say, look, Canberra, if you're in AUKUS, if you're in the Quad, if you're in ANZUS, don't bother talking to us? Or I guess you could say the same thing about Washington. If we start talking to China, then Washington would say, well, how committed can you be, Canberra, to AUKUS and ANZUS and the Quad, if at the same time you're running off and talking to Beijing at every opportunity as well? So do you see those minilaterals that Australia has committed to as being consistent with a constructive response to great power rivalry? I guess that's my question.
Yes. Yes, if we are using like the academic point, I quite like to tilt to the academic how we can use this kind of the middle power activism. Like, what is the middle power activism? Like, the middle power basically tilt to use this multilateral collaboration and negotiation and compromise solution to resolve the conflict. at the international level. And so that is like the way they use, even though right now is the unilateral groupings, it's still the same thing. They want to have the negotiation. They want to have this different party to sit down together to solve the problem. So that is part of the middle power activism. Another way is to say like the middle power also tilt to like you say you can say it's a conservative situation, or like to be acting as a stabilizer, want to maintain the status quo rather than interrupting the order, the regional order, the international order. And so they are basically conservative in order to preserve the status quo. So in that sense, I think the unilateral groupings, AUKUS and CORES and the Five Eyes, or all these other groupings, there's not much conflict with Australians' alliance with the US and Australian as a middle power activist in the region. However, to what extent that can, lower the tension or resolve the conflict in the region, and I actually think it's a little bit difficult. As I say, I lay out earlier about the nature of the conflict, and from both sides, I don't think there will be any compromise.
Yeah, thank you. Gee, it's not cut and dry, is it? As you say, you can certainly see sense in what Australia is trying to do through ANZUS and AUKUS and the Quad. But at the same time, you do have to consider how that might be interpreted in Beijing and how it might contribute to an escalatory spiral rather than lowering tensions. Now, I'm not saying that that fear should rule it out for Australia, but it is certainly something that we need to consider. Look, I might jump to a few questions from the audience at this point, and I'd encourage all of our audience to submit any questions that they have. Professor Zhu, I think I might put this one to you first. This is from Harry. He asks this, I'll just read it word for word. He says, has China neglected to acknowledge appropriately the awkward, difficult situation Australia finds itself in? If I can editorialize a little bit on Harry's question, and I think maybe he might be implying this as well, a lot of people will say in Australia will say, honestly, Beijing only has itself to blame, right? If you want to know why the Australian public has turned against China, well, look at the sanctions, look at the cutting off of dialogue, look at the detained Australians in China. Do you think that China is cognizant that its own actions have very much contributed to the anxiety that Australia feels, or do you just think that doesn't cross people's minds in Zhongnanhai and Beijing?
Thank you, Professor Harding. Glad you are here. Thanks for that question. I think perhaps it gradually comes to China gradually comes to the realization that these economic sanctions are hurting China-Australia relations, but also hurting China's international image. At the same time, I think Beijing is puzzled. Why Australia has been so proactive, in terms of following the United States to confront China. Because right now, you look at the global situation. We talk about international community. Really, we talk about a group of Western powers, confronting China, led by the United States. But who are those countries who are, more active in doing this? Well, you have Japan, Great Britain, and Australia, right? I think from Beijing's perspective, perhaps they can understand why Japan and Great Britain, will follow the United States so uncritically, right? Because Japan, China, due to this historical animosity and unresolved disputes, and Great Britain, perhaps because of the developments in Hong Kong, right? So Japan and the UK, can be kind of tough on China, understandable. But I think it's puzzling for Beijing why Australia is taking the leadership, especially in terms of, calling for COVID investigation, right? Those kind of things. But again, I'm not trying to defend Chinese policy, but I'm just trying to understand, why Beijing is doing that and how Beijing is thinking, through this process. By the way, I think, China is, I think, ready to reset relationship. I think, again, I remember Professor Lawrenson, you hosted Chinese ambassador Xiao Chen a couple of months ago. I think he mentioned at the talk that there was no such a thing called 14 demands, right? Those were distorted reports by media. So he was trying to tone down this rhetoric. So to get back to the question, Professor Harding, I think Beijing understands the negative impact of those policies, and I think it is ready to move forward. Especially we have a new government here in Canberra. It's a good opportunity, and also this December, the two countries will celebrate. Hopefully, they will celebrate, right? 50 years of anniversary, right? And it's really a great opportunity to move forward instead of going backwards.
Thank you, Lai-Hai. I might put a question to you. This is from, I think it's most appropriately put to an Australian, so I'll put it to you, Dr. Chen. This is from David. He asks, basically, if I can just paraphrase, he said, do you think Australian leaders are amenable to taking advice from Asian leaders? Like, I guess in the case of Penny Wong, I know just from my own research that she has singled out the Singaporean Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, as being a first-rate mind in terms of analysing changes in the region. Where do you think Australia's political leadership is at with that? I mean, is Penny Wong, our foreign minister, quite unique in that respect? Or do you think Australian leaders are actually willing to listen to the region rather than talk at the region?
Thank you, James. I think in terms of if we compare both political parties, and of course, I think Penny Wong or the current Labour Party, it will be more tilted to or if I use this kind of the foreign policy, the traditional foreign policy, separating into two great parties, even though fundamentally the overall picture is the same, but how to implement the policy, that's still slightly different. And I would say Labour Party or Penny Wong would be happy to negotiate or discuss with the ASEAN country, with the Asian country, or in terms of the collaboration, there will be much more willingness to collaborate rather than compare with the previous governments.
Right. So as long as the current government is in place and Penny Wong's the foreign minister, we can have some optimism. If in a few years' time there's a change of government,
yes, or collaborate together with the middle power activism.
Sure. Okay, Professor Zhu, back to you. Look, this is a question from Jamie, and I think this is a question we often talk amongst ourselves about in Australia. So let me put it to you. The question is this: are there any other US allies in Asia whose China policy you think Australia could profitably learn from, or perhaps even emulate? Now, no one's talking about Australia wholesale adopting Japan's approach or South Korea's approach or whoever, but are there any countries that, if you got a chance to speak to folks in Canberra, and you probably already have, who would you nominate that they should have a good look at?
Well, thank you, Jamie. I mentioned South Korea. I really think that the South Korean model perhaps is something that Australia can look into. You don't have to copy what they do, but South Korea, of course, South Korea is different from Australia because South Korea has this North Korean issue. So South Korea perhaps needs China more than Australia does. But still, I think so far, the South Korean government, as I said, in the presentation, doesn't matter. The president is from a liberal camp or conservative camp, either perceived to be pro-US or pro-China. I think all presidents so far have tried to maintain a fine balance here, and not taking a side with either power. I think they fully understand the importance of both powers for South Korea's security and economic interests. And that's how they have handled this delicate situation. China is not just economically important for South Korea, but also in terms of security, right? Because without the China's cooperation, you cannot resolve the North Korean issue. So maybe South Korea is not the perfect example for Australia because South Korea has to deal with the North Korean issue. But I think what South Korea has been doing is interesting and meaningful here. Perhaps Australia can take a page from. But Singapore, of course, not an ally, but Singapore is even a much smaller power than Australia, you know. And I always wonder how they can, you know, maneuver so well among these major powers in dealing with both China and the United States. And they enjoy both strong relations with both powers. Now, that's something, again, perhaps Australia can look into. But again, I don't think these cases are the same. You know, each country has unique challenges. But certainly, I would always argue that definitely there's more than one way of dealing with the rise of China, especially this confrontational way that is dominating the Western approach. I don't think that's the only way, and I don't think that's the best way. No.
Look, I can't resist following up with a quick question from Carl, someone from New Zealand in our audience. And he asks, have you had the opportunity to study New Zealand's approach, and do you see it as being significantly different to Australia's? Again, we're not saying that Australia should copy the New Zealand approach, but just quickly, have you had a chance to look at New Zealand while you've been in Australia?
No, I haven't. You know, I tried to obtain an opportunity to visit New Zealand, but so far I have failed. You know? All
right, we'll have to ask Carl to get you across to New Zealand.
So those in the audience from New Zealand, please, I want to go and give me an opportunity. You know? But seriously, you know, I think you know, yes, New Zealand is another example that shows a different alternative. You know, just across the ditch. New Zealand has not been so proactively, you know, following a particular model, and they're trying to insist that they have their own national interests, and their approach may be different from others. So again, these are all good examples, you know. And I'm not going to give any prescription for Australia, of course, you know, but New Zealand definitely. Also in terms of AUKUS, you know, right, a nuclear policy. I think perhaps Australia can also learn something from New Zealand.
Thank you. Dr. Chan, if I could just get a quick response from you on this one. Sorry, we are running out of time, but it's from Zhiqun Zhu. And he asks, asks, how should we understand recent engagements between China and the island countries in Oceania? You know, will China's engagements in Oceania intensify the Sino-American and Sino-Australian conflict? I mean, do you see Chinese engagement in Oceania as being inevitable? And if that's the case, is that inevitably going to spiral US-China and Australia-China tension? So I know it's a big question, but if you could keep your answer as, I'd like to hear your thoughts, but if you could keep it as brief as possible, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you. If I can give a very short answer, I think the answer is yes. Right. Yeah, I apologize for this rather pessimistic view today. The weather is going a bit forecast.
Yes. Okay, so we should expect that to continue.
Yes, and I actually want to, like, if I can briefly relate it to just remind me about earlier Professor Zhu's presentation. I mentioned about one point about this South Pacific's, what China can contribute to the region. In terms of the economic or in terms of the environmental issue, I actually think it might be a bit difficult because whether China is the largest carbon dioxide emitter, and how can China contribute to that, and of course that you need more details and how to China's contribution into that region. And in terms of this kind of conflict between the two great powers in the region, and I think it will be in the coming years to come, that will be more and more tense between two sides, because I think you can see the interests of both sides, and it will be hard for them to withdraw from that region as well. And Australia is the same thing, and certainly Australia will ally with the US in this respect.
Right, so we're dealing with structural issues here, trends, rather than peaks and troughs. So it's a challenging, not year ahead, but a challenging decades ahead. Thanks, Dr. Chen. Professor Zhu, I would just like to go to you for the final question today, and it's a very open-ended one. It's always great to hear an outsider's perspective on Australian debates, as I led off with this session by saying, I think it's easy if you live in Sydney or Canberra to get trapped in a bit of a bubble, just like it would be if you're in Washington or Beijing, to be frank. So can I just invite you, by way of finishing today, to share with our audience any elements of the Australian debate around the United States, US-China great power competition, the Australia-China relationship that have surprised you perhaps during your time here. Very open-ended, over to you.
Okay. Hi, James. I have not been here long enough to get a real deep understanding of what is going on in this beautiful country, really beautiful country, you know. But I did look at a Lowy Institute poll published in June 2022, which says that over 50% of Australians surveyed would support sending troops to Taiwan if war breaks out across the Taiwan Strait. This is quite surprising to me. I'm not sure how informed these people are about the history and the current status of the China-Taiwan issue. And are they willing to sacrifice their sons and daughters to fight a war with China over Taiwan? I guess I need to learn more about what these people think and how they came to that conclusion. You know, so that is one big surprise for me. You know, on the other hand, I'm also perhaps pleasantly surprised that there are also many moderate voices here. You know, such as Hugh White and Stephen Fitzgerald, Michael Pembroke, Colin Mackerras, you know, and other contributors to polls and irritations. You know, I think, you know, again, this is based on very limited interactions with folks here. I think you have more serious and dynamic discussions about important foreign policy issues here than back in the United States, really. I think in Washington, you know, it's the political atmosphere is so poisoned that, you know, it is very difficult to raise a different voice, to propose some moderate options, alternative options to the current policy. But here, I think you have more serious and more dynamic discussions, and that's really encouraging.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhu. I actually think that's a very incisive comment, and it's something that's crossed my mind before as well. I often get the impression that in Washington, when I look at the Australian visitors that go to Washington, that give talks there, they do have a very particular perspective on Australia-China relations. And so I'm not sure the full diversity of Australia's discussion and debate on China is actually being accurately carried across to Washington. So perhaps a few more of those moderate voices that you mentioned before might be able to get a trip to Washington and explain that diversity, just as we hope you're able to do when you get back home. Okay, look, I think we're going to wrap it up there. To my colleague, Corey, I'm going to throw back to you to formally wrap things up.
Okay, thank you to Professor Zhu for your excellent presentation, and thanks to Dr. Chan and to Professor Lawrenson for your participation in the discussion. So members of the audience will be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it. It will help us make future UTS ACRI events a better experience for everyone involved. So if you want to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org, no spaces. The discussion today will also be available there. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news. That's ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to our speakers and all our attendees. See you next time.